All right, welcome to the first show of 2025. How about that? Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shauna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And Dr. Lisa, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Good to be back after a little bit of a break. So hopefully
hmm
everyone is doing well and bracing for a another 12 months of the roller coaster ride that is life.
Wait, Lisa, you reminded me of a quick news story where this gentleman was shown on a video at the top of a roller coaster, and
hmm
apparently his lap band broke, and he had like a
Oh
few
my.
seconds to figure out whether he was going to get out or not. You know how you can get off, or like if
Yeah,
someone's
yeah,
doing
yeah.
maintenance on the roller coaster, there's a walkway. He had like a few seconds to decide whether he was going to get off or not, and he actually got off.
Oh my gosh.
Unfortunately, we in real life, in the socio-political context, don't have the option to get off
Uh-uh.
this train quite yet,
No.
this roller coaster quite yet. So yeah, you just reminded me of that visual. That's where we are right now, aren't we?
I know that actually is
Um,
quite terrifying
it
that you have to
is.
make a split second decision about can you
It
get off in time
is.
to get to the platform or what the hell is going to happen if you don't get off
Yes.
and the thing goes down.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So anyway, yeah, I feel for the
Oh,
guy.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel for the guy. So anyhow. Oh, so we've got good conversation to have as we get started with the new year. We previously talked about our non-New Year's resolutions.
Right.
But there's lots of things to think about in regards to our field of DEI, given that, of course, we are still moving forward, hopefully with courage in uh, a socio-political context that is still trying to push back against the work. So here we are. Here we are. But so Dr. Lisa, let's dive into this word posturing. And I want you to kind of help me out here with thinking through this word of the week, given that it's continued to come up for me, whether I'm reflecting on my own work in DEI or other folks' reception to DEI work. When I looked up the term, it said posturing refers to behavior or speech that's intended to attract attention, mislead, or create a certain impression. It can be artificial, hypocritical, or calculated. And I thought it was interesting because when I think about that word posturing and the way that I've seen it play out, oftentimes is folks that may be in one of my trainings or professional development or so forth, but also with DEI, quote unquote, experts that sometimes take on this posture of expert, right? Expert or resistant, or I don't have need of that information because I'm a good person. Like there's some type of performativeness to the posturing that I'm still trying to grapple with when we think about this work. But have you engaged or
hmm
seen people engaging in posturing as you do this work as well?
Yeah, I think the image that comes to mind is someone who kind of like pushes out their chest, like this kind of bravado or I know everything. I also think that particularly people from marginalized identity groups can be accused of posturing, right? Um, as a means to undermine their knowledge and expertise. So I think I've seen that as well happen. Oh, they're just posturing, right? They don't really know. We don't really need to listen to them. So, and then something that's just come up for me that we don't won't discuss here, but could be another word of the week is virtue signaling, and the degree to which posturing and virtue signaling might overlap, perhaps. So maybe that's what we do another time, but that's where I'm thinking about with that.
Oh goodness, yes, 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 yes. What virtues am I trying to posture, perform, portray to other people? Yeah, that makes complete sense with that connection. Yeah, absolutely. So, something to think about. My goal, as I do my own self-reflection, is to lower, diminish, hopefully remove any form of posturing, but we're all human. Of course, it's going to happen. So I'm just kind of grappling with it as I see it and hopefully don't see it as much in myself. But I think it's something that we should hold on to as we're continuing to do the work individually. So, all right, but let's get into phase one. Phase one. So I think what's interesting as I continue to do overlapping work with human resources folks, as you all can imagine, there's lots of organizations that may not have someone that is in charge of orchestrating all things DEI in their particular workplace. But if they have it or not, human resources, obviously we're talking about human beings, a diversity of human beings, they're going to touch upon DEI topics and considerations. And one of them for me is around what engagement looks like in the workplace. And I've seen that engagement is kind of a buzzword for a lot of human resource folks in regards to we want to increase engagement, we want to increase engagement. And so, as someone who kind of plays double dutch with human resources, sometimes I'm in the conversation with HR folks, sometimes I'm outside critiquing in. Um, I want to define engagement better. And after we define engagement better, I want to think about what constitutes engagement and how sometimes, Lisa, we're comparing apples to oranges, right? So if I reflect many, many moons ago when I was newer, not necessarily entry level, but newer in the workplace, I wanted things that looked more like happy hour after work or something outside of the 9 to 5 or something social. Let's go and, have a social event every quarter or something like that. I wanted at that time. Now, let's be clear. The Shauna then compared to the Shauna now is quite different. I have other responsibilities. There's never enough time in the day. 9 to 5 is already hard enough to fulfill, much less doing something before or after. And so now engagement looks quite different for me in that, yes, I give that 100% while I'm there, but if I show up at 8:59 and I leave at 5:01, I don't feel like that's up for critique because I've been 100+% engaged all day. And so my engagement is just defined differently. And so, Lisa, I'm wondering what lands on you as you think about engagement as far as how you would define it. And how might we be a bit more nuanced in thinking about engagement? Because I don't think it's a cookie cutter approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to help our DEI/HR folks out to make sure that we're not setting unfair or at least unattainable goals for engagement for everyone that might just not work for them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think about your classic employee engagement survey, right? That is asking oftentimes questions around culture and community. And so I think about employee engagement as being understood in the context of your office community. Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel involved? And a measure of that belonging and involvement is the degree to which you engage both inside and outside of the workspace. Um, but certainly, yeah, growing up when I was much younger, happy hours would be a big thing, holiday parties, or just any kind of party, I suppose. Other outside of work activities, and that would be the stick with which, we would measure whether or not someone is a team player or connected to the organization. And if people did not participate in said activities, then certainly they might be considered standoffish or not a team player or awkward, socially awkward, right? Or just kind of boring. There would be all these other labels placed on them. And so I do think this is an interesting issue from a DEI perspective around how are we thinking about inclusion and how are we defining engagement, to your first point, right? There needs to be a difference in how we think about that based on people's outside of work responsibilities. The other thing that popped into my head when you were talking, Shauna, is the way, I think we've talked about this before, that some organizations want to build community. And so the way to do that is through this like nebulous engagement. But they also talk about themselves as being a family. And I find that to be highly problematic because families are really dysfunctional. And so they also create guilt and shame and
Yes.
obligations that you do not
Yes.
want to be putting on your employees, right? So if you talk about your workplace
Yes.
as a family and doing anything for each other, and then you don't show up for that happy hour because you've got some other thing to do, and then there's like, comments and whispers about your absence and that you're not really part of the family, right? You just don't fit in. Like that feels
Hmm.
troubling. So it feels like there's this soup that exists around employee engagement that speaks to belonging, inclusion,
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
those
Yes.
not being appreciative of people's different commitments or engagement style or what engagement might mean. To your point, I've been
Hmm.
100% engaged for 8 hours. Now I want to go home and chill, or I've got to go pick up my kids and take them to the 1900 sporting activities that they have to do. So,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
that's what's
Yeah.
coming up for me, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and let's be honest. I want to be fair. I want to be, I don't even know if fair is the right word. I want to be aware that there are some commitments outside of the workplace that I'm not aware of. And there are also commitments that if you don't have children, or if you don't have elderly parents, or if you don't have a fish in a bowl, you would not understand the responsibilities that come with it. And so I feel this tension because I'm like, you have no clue that most folks that have outside responsibilities, we kind of call it first, second, third shift. Like you've already worked a whole shift, if you will, of household responsibilities before you even get to work. And then you got to prepare to do another shift after that based on responsibilities. And so, given that some of the things that when I did not have children, when I was closer to home. And so my parents and grandparents were younger and more self-sufficient than they are now. I didn't have to think of, so they weren't even on my radar until now. And so it's kind of like trying to help other generations to understand other responsibilities that they haven't encountered and may never encounter, but they're still part of real life. Like I don't want anyone commiserating that my kids have 17 activities after work. At the same time, I want them to be cognizant that they have 17 activities after work. And so there is a reason as to why I'm not going to be engaged outside of 9 to 5 or whatever the traditional office hours might be. And I think let me add something to your soup, Lisa, that you brought up earlier, is that I don't care for the unspoken penalty that people pay for not engaging traditionally. And so what I mean by that, we can go from everything from a happy hour to a, quarterly picnic for whatever it is. When we're talking about that family dynamic that you were bringing up before, that comes with very different responsibilities and commitments to one another. And it comes with a level of access that I'm not sure everyone cares to share, right? So let me give you an example of this that happened with one of my clients previously. So in this particular division that I was working with, there was one gentleman that was not traditionally engaged in the after hours activities. There was even a quarterly uh, weekend event that was held all the time. The younger generations in the department were dragging his name through the mud because he didn't show up to these events that he never engaged in. He didn't even speak on them because he didn't weigh in on, well, he doesn't care what food we have at the event because he's not going to be there type of thing. So they perceived that as, like you mentioned, standoffish, not engaged, not sold out on their work. Now, it's not their business, and they may never know that this man was battling cancer. And he was trying to keep it confidential. He was trying to make sure that it didn't become an excuse for whatever challenges, or maybe ever so often, no, I can't give you this deadline on Monday, but I can do it on Tuesday because I'm grappling with the after effects of chemo. he didn't bring that up because he didn't want it to be an excuse, and it still ended up becoming a weapon for against him. And so, and I'm looking back at the whole scenario, I'm looking at the whole thing play out, thinking, y'all have no idea what this man is going through right now, but I don't have liberty to tell you that. And so I'm going to sit back and watch y'all in your judgment as to what you think is going on. Now, eventually, later on, many months later, he shared with them what was going on because he started losing hair and some other things that were happening that just couldn't be masked, if you will. And all of them look like fucking idiots because of the judgment that they put on him. But I think about this all the time around how we judge each other, and we may never get the full story, but we're going to keep carrying that judgment, and it works against people who are already marginalized at work based on salary, based on role, based on position, based on promotion. To me, I'm like, this deserves a whole nother conversation, Lisa. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
penalizing people in ways that we have not acknowledged yet because we haven't gotten clear on what's in the soup. It's just the soup.
Right. Right. And then how that changes generationally or based on personality type. And if you really want to have an inclusive workplace, then building community is going to
Mm-hmm.
take more than a forced happy hour, right? Where you clock who's there and who's not, and then hold it against them. Like
That's
there's a
right.
lot more
That's
that you need
right.
to do, and so if you have such a narrow understanding of engagement as being showing up to events and or speaking a lot in the workplace, right? Then you are not going
Mm-hmm.
to be you're not casting that net very wide, and you're going to be pushing people out and making them feel ostracized, I would imagine.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Well, and is it really okay? So let me. This is an existential question that we're not going to have the answer for, and then we can go to phase two. But is it truly engagement if Shauna and Lisa are forced into, let's say,
Right.
mandatory fun time, but Lisa's too worried about her ailing grandmother at home to even enjoy the happy hour or to hear what her coworkers are saying? And Shauna's like, oh, I'm paying double for this extended time for a babysitter to be here because
Right.
I can't lose my job. Are you really at the highest
Right.
level of engagement if you have all this cooking in the background?
Yeah.
You're
No.
still defeating the point of engagement.
Right. 100%. Yeah.
Ugh. Yeah. So I don't think HR folks are getting what they think they
Mm-mm.
want out of
Right. Right.
engagement.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
hmm
All right.
yeah.
So let's engage in phase two authentically. Um,
Yes, yes.
so what's the phase two discussion topic, Shauna?
So all right, listen to this, Lisa. So I'm again torn on a few things.
Mm-hmm.
Um I'm concerned about language choices.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember someone in one of my trainings a couple of weeks ago saying that DEI has an image problem. And I love the way that they said that because this person was in marketing and branding for the organization I was working with. And so this person went on to say, a lot of people actually are pro DEI as far as concepts, but they're anti DEI in regards to labeling and sound bites. And I was like,
Mm.
woof, that is so interesting.
Yeah.
So, for example, Lisa, you and I, we've done trainings before where if we're in, let's say, a California or a
Mm-hmm.
Maryland or other places that are more open to DEI education, professional development training, we might use much more focused, pointed language like
Mm-hmm.
privilege, like oppression, like white privilege, like, those types
Yeah.
of words that still are true when you look at the definitions and the applications of them versus other DEI averse settings like I've been in Florida or North Carolina or Texas and other places
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
we might use language like headwinds and tailwinds for privilege and oppression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so what I think is important for us to think about, Lisa, is as we continue to sharpen our skills as facilitators, as we speak to folks that may be looking for a depth facilitators, or if you are listening right now and you're a facilitator and you're trying to put more tools in your toolkit around facilitation, Lisa, I think we need to think pretty critically about being aware of audiences, being aware of how adults learn,
Mm-hmm.
and being aware of how to make sure that we meet the goal of the education without turning people off immediately because of whether it's power dynamics or just people that aren't ready for specific types of language, Lisa. So if you're a one trick pony in every setting, then you're bound to have some pushback, some challenges,
Right,
so forth.
right.
And how you take that feedback to sharpen your skill sets is important, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, I know you and I both have, you know, every blue moon, we might have a critique of, hey, why don't we tweak this or work on this or deliver this differently? I don't think either one of us have been like vehemently, against that tweak because we
Yeah.
thought about it going into it. I would imagine.
Yeah, I think audience does matter. And I just had this conversation with students in a class that I taught last year about if
Okay.
you're presenting to a legislator or,
Mm,
some other group of people that has influence over policy and you want to articulate kind of a strong position of social justice, but you're using terms like white privilege and heterosexism and heteropatriarchy and things like that, which, I totally understand what you're talking about and I'm on board, but you are potentially
yes.
talking to a mixed view audience. So some of those terms, to your point, have a branding problem, right? For good or for bad, they do. And so how do you change
Mm-hmm.
your language? But the thing that I always come back to and where I think I struggle
Mm-hmm.
is the degree to which I should shift my language to accommodate a person with identity privileges comfort, right? So
Mm,
I'm not
mm-hmm.
going to
Mm-hmm.
say these things because I'm so scared about turning you off or having you shut down, which really just doesn't then create the conditions for you to grow as a human.
That's right. That's right.
Versus I'm using terminology that might be outdated or harmful in some way, because we know that language shifts so rapidly. So hearing feedback from a marginalized person that a term that I used is no longer acceptable, or phrasing that I used didn't land right on that marginalized person, that feels different to me than a white person who gets prickly because I use white privilege, or even tailwinds, right? They get prickly about it. And so where do I bend, right? Where do I say, yes, that is 100%, I get you, I'm not going to say that anymore, versus, well, I want to challenge you to think about this concept and I'm not going to change my language because this is an important part of understanding how you exist in the world, right? Like, I don't know if you have any advice there, but when you're talking around audience context, shifting language, I think abstractly, yes, I agree with you. And then I come down into this micro level where at what point am I acquiescing and letting people off the
Yes.
hook, right?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I think, to your point, there's a couple things going on there. A marginalized identity group that I'm not a part of, I'm not a member of, educating me on language usage is one thing. So that's in a bucket right there. But another bucket is language that an individual is offended by, and we haven't really gotten to the root of the offense. Is the offendedness because you either don't agree or we don't have the same definition of the term, and so therefore we're talking about things in different ways and we're kind of ships passing in the night when it comes to communication, or it is what I call that productive discomfort. That's a whole different category, right? Oftentimes, I will say not all offendedness is the same, in my opinion, right? There are some folks that are offended because they're like, whoa, that is damn near a slur term, so please don't use it. That's one thing. Other folks that are defensive, and so they use being offended as a way to push back on our attempt to educate, to enlighten. And then there's a group that it's a choice to be offended so they can attempt to shut down our work broadly. And so trying to figure out which offended we're working with here. I'm always trying to figure out which offended are we working with. Um, and sometimes I have time to figure that out. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes it's a fleeting moment. But in each and every case, I'm still reflecting on it. Like I'm not, regardless of the three, I'm not immediately going to the posturing of it is what it is, and you either get down with it or you don't. I'm usually going back to that curiosity point of, I'm wondering if they're offended because they've never heard this before and it's new. Or, I wonder if they're offended because I used a word that's not appropriate in their identity group. Or, I'm wondering if they're offended because they just literally haven't used the muscle of practicing going to this extent of this language. They're not there yet. Because we have to remember in our work, we talk about this every day. Like the words you rattled off with your student with, white privilege, white supremacy, heteronormativity, these are words that we use every day, damn near all day. So we're used to hearing and processing it and knowing what people mean immediately versus the person that rarely hears patriarchy in a lifetime, and they're hearing it over and over and over and over again in one of our sessions. Yeah, that is going to be uncomfortable. But is that discomfort productive for you? Because if it gets to a point where it's shutting down knowledge, then I'm like, okay, we got to figure out, is this productive discomfort or discomfort that literally is amygdala hijack where your brain literally cannot process it.
Right. Right.
That's a distinction that we got to figure it out.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to do in the moment though, right? Like
That's right. That's right.
I do think there can be you can push people too far in the choices of your language and so then you've lost them, right?
Yes. 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 Yes.
Versus just the antagonist, the person who is purposefully quote unquote offended, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they grew up, working class, low socioeconomic status, so that really that
Mm-hmm.
eradicates their whiteness, right? Like, how dare
Right.
you say that
Right.
they benefit from their skin color in any way, kind of thing. And they're
Mm-hmm.
just being contrarian to be contrarian, right? Because they don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's
Yes.
just a lot happening, right? Especially now we're in this climate, as you mentioned earlier, that is now increasingly hostile to any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And
Mm-hmm.
how do we even, like we talked about with Walmart, right? They're moving towards the term belonging instead of DEI. Like that's a strategic move, right? To
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
belong, you have to engage with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you're just not going to say that, right?
That's the workaround. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the workaround.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's
Hmm.
the workaround too. Because belonging is that word that hasn't yet been stigmatized. Like,
Right,
I would love for someone to, somebody probably has already gone through this trajectory of in vogue DEI language over time and what's been challenging for some, and then eventually it worked out of being challenging to then it's now, oh, this is the usual language that we use. Like there has to have been a cycle of language. Like think about, Lisa, how in many years ago we used language like cultural tolerance that I would never use now because I don't
right,
want
right.
anybody tolerating me. I want
Yeah,
acceptance. I want. So
yeah.
there has to have been a trajectory of acceptable language that we're now phasing out of and into a new phase that we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it will be interesting to see how this ends up playing out in the context of just conversations and then in more
Mm-hmm.
formal settings, training, right? Or larger kind of initiatives that are happening
That's
and
right.
how do both trainers and educators respond,
Mm-hmm.
reflectively as you articulated, and then how do participants respond in what ways will the language shift or the climate change that for us?
Yeah, yeah, because it's going to keep changing. I mean,
Mm.
and I just feel, I feel like I remember when I was like this elementary school. worksheets that we used to use with vocabulary, where you'd have like all the words on one column and all the definitions on the other, and you would draw a line
Mm,
between the word and its definition. I feel like the definitions are the same, but the words are changing, and
right,
now we're
right.
having to match in a different game.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what I
yeah.
feel like is happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we'll see. But again, when you're in a field like ours that is not settling on a professional standard all the time,
Right.
then who gets to determine what? Because I've been through some of those professional DEI professional standards programs, and they didn't agree on what was the standard
Yeah.
terminology for certain things. So I'm like, well, shoot, if the professionals in that field can't agree, then who else will? I don't
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
I
All
don't
right.
know.
Well, since we don't have an answer to that, we'll just that's this is a wait and see. Let's go ahead and shift into phase 3.
Yeah.
So this phase is based on an article that Shauna had shared with me related to grandparents who are not grandparents. They are people who wanted to be grandparents but did not get the opportunity to be grandparents because their child decided not to, or maybe was unable to have biologically have children, right? Because obviously you could adopt or foster, but are choosing to not have children in their life, thereby creating a situation where the grandparent isn't a grandparent, right? So I have such mixed feelings about this, because I do understand that a person might have become excited over time to be a grandparent, and that then that not happening might create some grief and loss for the person. But then I have to question, why did you have that expectation in the first place, right? It's not your decision. I think that the world is not one where a lot of people want to bring children into it, right? With climate change, with this shifting kind of rightward move, and rise of autocracy, and women's bodies being controlled and such. And so I'm just, yeah, it landed on me strangely because I feel like it's up to me whether or not I choose to have a child. It's got really nothing to do with my parents, right? That decision has got nothing to do with them. And then if they're sad that they didn't have a grandparent and make me feel bad about it, or even if they don't make me feel bad about it, right? Like I just, yeah. So I'm having some conflict, Shauna. And since you sent me the article, I would love to hear your thoughts on it and what spurred you to send it to me. Like what made
Yeah.
you kind of pause and say, "Huh, this is a really great, interesting thing."
Yeah. Well, I think about a number of things. So let me kind of take you through, a couple of phases of my life here where I personally was not one of those potential parents that said, it's part of my identity. I must have children. And I know that is a very surprising based on the gender norms in this country, especially coming from a woman of, oh, well, womanhood is wrapped up in motherhood. It wasn't for me at all. It was not. And so given that children were even the potential of children was icing on a very good cake of my life that already existed. If I had them, then great. If I didn't have them, my life was still great. So that's where I was before Trey and Kendrick. Now that I have them, it's yes, they are the center of many universes, and I would be a completely different person without them. Not that I wouldn't be a whole person, but I would be a different person. I think that also too becomes reflective on when I had my children. I had my children in my 30s. I know that will land differently for people. But I was a fully developed human being before I had these two, and then they came. And so now having them and seeing my parents change as people, as grandparents, is quite fascinating to me. The things that they get to do with the boys that they just literally could not afford in time or money to do when I was a kid. The complete focus that that any parent probably would have a hard time giving to a kid, especially parents that work outside of the home. I mean, it's just our systems are not set up for that. Lisa and I have beat that point to the hilt, so I'm not going to go there again. And so now that I have them and I've witnessed my parents become grandparents, and even jokingly have said to my ex-husband that I probably would not have any other relationship with other than grandchildren. We've had jokes about one day watching grandkids run around in a backyard somewhere. And so I think it does, the grief would be there because of the expectation. And Lisa, I'm not saying it's a fair expectation. I don't think it is a fair expectation for parents to look forward to being grandparents, because it's not their body and it's not their decision and it's not their future and it's not that. Um, and at the same time, this potential fun that may occur when they have more time and they have more resources and they have more flexibility to be more of a presence. Um, it kind of reminds me of, Lisa, you remember we've talked about this before during the pandemic, where life had to slow down for people to then notice things they didn't get to notice before. I wonder, and I think it's true, that once grandparents are at a place where their life is slower, they get to notice things about grandchildren that they didn't get to notice about their own children's human development. It's a huge gift, yet not an obligation. And so I'm torn too, Lisa, in that the grandparents that were mentioned in this article agreed with you, saying that of course it's my kid's responsibility. And if I were, it's my kid's choice, it's my kid's responsibility. If I were in my kid's current day shoes, I probably wouldn't have kids either, based on the context, but I still grieve not watching the human development of this little person. I think both can be true at the same time, yet I also feel like the selfishness goes in both ways. And I mean good selfishness. I don't mean bad selfishness, meaning what I want in the moment. So I can understand the non-parents making the decision for self and for their unborn, unpotentialized kids that, nope, I don't want you here in this mess. This is a mess. The earth is a mess. The socially it's a mess. Politically it's a mess. It's a mess. And I'm being a responsible human by not bringing you into it. I understand that completely. And I also understand the grandparents are like, yeah, this place is shot to hell. And oh, I would have enjoyed being more present for someone else, the ways in which I was not able to be more present for my kids. I think both can be true at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. There's, I think part of what rubs me the wrong way a little bit is the like, I'm going to get a do over with the grandchild because I messed up as a parent. And I know in some cases it's not that they messed up, it's that they didn't have the time because they had to work three jobs. They may have been a single parent. There are these other like things, right? So this isn't every example, but in the example where a parent wasn't as emotionally present for their children, they've realized it later in life and now they want to do over with the grandkid because they do have more time, they can be more emotionally present. That rubs me the wrong way, right? Like, you want to use a child of mine to right the wrongs between you and I. Like, and I know that the people in the article weren't necessarily saying that, but it just makes me think about that as one of the reasons why a non grandparent might be grieving not being a grandparent, right? I wanted to do it differently this time. Well, hello, I'm your child and I'm still standing here and you need to still repair this damage, right? Like, do you know what I mean?
Mm,
That's where I feel like
mm-hmm,
that's where it's
mm-hmm.
like, there's a little bit of friction
Yeah.
for me there.
Yeah, yeah. And well, and so that, yeah, and that's one slice of the perspective. And then the other slice of the perspective is I did the very best I could. If I looked back, I wouldn't change a thing. And I'm still looking forward to grandkids. Like you have those. So I realize that it's a whole lot of things that can be true at one time, because I'm looking at some current grandparents that I know of other kids where they're like, hey, I did a fantastic job with what I had with my adult child. And now I get to do more. I get to do other things. I just have more resources to do more. And the thing that I think, based on the little bit of research I've done on parent development, is that we don't do enough on parent development, right? Like we
Mm,
don't do
mm,
enough research on how parents develop over time
okay.
because we primarily focus on child development and we don't
Yeah.
look at the parallel tracks of the parent developing over time as well. Because the things that I look at now where I'm like, I truly did not give a shit about before these boys came here that now I do care about, that's a human
Yeah.
development piece that we don't do research on. We don't, it's very little research that looks at that at all because I know it sounds cliche, but no one hands you a manual that tells you how to be a parent at starting at different points in life, at different points in your kid's life. I tell my parents all the time when the boys were first going to daycare, I was doing my best not to be disrespectful, but also giving them the reality of 30 something years later. Mom, dad, it's not the same thing. We don't have grandparents that live within walking distance of a daycare, and
Mm,
daycare is not $80 a week like it was when I was a kid. So the apples to oranges correlation is not here. So I don't feel like I can even have a real
right.
conversation with you about my lived experience as a parent because context, right? And so, but no one tracks that development over time and what that looks like over time.
Mm,
Or even parents where, your kid is, teenager or older, and now you move from super protective parent to now more of a mentor role because the peer influence is heavier than your influence. Like nobody tracks that stuff. And I definitely have not seen the parent development piece um, based on the age at which you become a parent and the number of children, and of course, sliced and diced by identity group. You don't see
mm-hmm.
that.
Well, and then even tracking that development beyond parenthood into grandparenthood, right? Like if you think about the
Mm-hmm.
longer arc, if there are grandchildren in your life,
That's
how do
right.
you develop as a
That's right.
parent into grandparent, right? And that can happen at many. I mean, some people are grandparents at like 37, right? Like
Oh, exactly.
versus
Right.
67, right? So
Right.
that's also going to make a huge difference because you think about the speed at which you become a parent and then a grandparent in 37 years of your life. I mean, that's just breakneck speed, right?
Wait a
Like
minute. You're
how on, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. I started laughing because I've said this before to the boys' dad when we, let's say we go to a parent meeting or we'll see an email that pops up about something that's going on at school. And he and I will text each other back and say, see, there goes some of those young parents again. Like we're already in
Oh,
judgmental state because there's some things that are prioritized over other things, and we do judge. I'm not gonna lie, we're not perfect. We judge and we're like, yeah, that comes from a young parent perspective. That does not come from an older parent perspective at all. So um, at Trey's elementary school, they had a little dance around Halloween. And there was already a pre-approved playlist that was a clean playlist without certain language, et cetera, that was already
mm-hmm.
approved and handed over to the DJ. The parents, who we deemed younger parents, on this chat were complaining that certain songs weren't on the playlist. And the principal had to respond back and say they weren't on the playlist because of the language and some other things. And so that's why they weren't on. And again, me and dad texting back and forth, yep, that's a young parent, because the fact that the principal even had to stop in the middle of their
Right.
day to explain that shit to you tells us that you're at a different developmental level than some other parents are. We knew that
Yeah.
certain songs were not going to be on that playlist because every other word is a curse word. Of course, it's not going to be on there. But the fact that someone had to explain that to you tells us that you're at a different arc in your human and parental development, that we're at a different place.
Oh shit. I bet there are like 45-year-olds that don't know those songs and didn't know that there was like expletives throughout them, right? And they're like, "Oh, why isn't this song?" Yeah, I don't know that that is connected to age. That could also just be connected to like not giving a crap and or unaware of the song. um
They're just
Interesting.
like, yeah, I'm
Interesting.
like, that is so interesting. So anyway, I think the grief, and I so appreciated the voices in the article that talked
Mhm.
about the both and of respecting and loving their kids, and actually not that they need their approval, but approving, no, don't have no kids in this messed up situation.
Right.
They
Right.
agreed with their kids' decision, yet at the same time
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
grappling with not having them was such a yeah, my mind was blown as I was reading that part of it. So anyway,
Yeah. So we'll leave that. We'll put that link in the show notes so you can take a look. Because
yeah.
maybe it will create some friction for you, or it will offer some aha moments, as it did for us. And but with that, I think that's it. Let's wrap it up, Shauna. So, first
Woof,
episode of
woof.
2025 done and done.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So we got through the first one of the year, but really glad to be back with you all in 2025 as we continue on this trajectory. Look, we are on the path to 200, y'all. Can you believe that? On the path to 200 episodes. So please go back, dig into the crates, if you will, and go back and listen to some of those archived episodes. You can find all of our episodes at unfazedpodcast.com, where you can find the archived old shows as well as the new shows. YouTube, if you want to see us as we laugh and giggle, please check us out on YouTube. Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're on the go, if you're on your run, your walk, your workout, and want to listen to us, you can listen there. Certainly, we'll have Unfazed Pod on Instagram up for you to see our visuals there, as well as on LinkedIn. So, if you like this week's episode, please like, subscribe, leave a review, share with your friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So, happy 2025, everyone.
Yeah. See you next week.